Why being born as Elvis Presley sucks. Imagine being the most recognizable face on the entire planet, but not being allowed to walk into a grocery store for 20 years. Imagine having millions of people screaming your name while you sit alone in a bedroom with the windows blacked out and aluminum foil taped to the glass to keep the sun away. Most people see the jumpsuits, the gold records, and the private jets, but the real story of Elvis Presley is a tragedy about why being born Elvis was a slow-motion execution of a human soul. It's a masterclass in how fame can turn a charismatic boy into a hollowed-out product, and how the world's love can become a suffocating weight that eventually kills you. In an industry that treats people like oil wells, how did the most talented man in the world end up dying alone in a bathroom, trapped in a body he no longer recognized? To understand why being Elvis sucked, you have to realize that he wasn't even born as a whole person in his own mind. He was born a twin, but his brother Jesse was stillborn. From his first breath, Elvis carried the weight of a ghost. He spent his entire life trying to live for two people, fueled by a mother whose love was so intense, it became a psychological prison. Gladys Presley was so protective that she wouldn't let him out of her sight, creating a bond that made the outside world seem terrifying and predatory. He grew up in extreme poverty, moving from house to house, always feeling like an outsider who didn't belong. When he finally found fame, it wasn't a release. It was just a larger, more expensive cage. When his mother died in 1958, right as he was drafted into the army, the only anchor he had was gone. Elvis often said that his life ended the day his mother died. He spent the next 20 years drifting in a sea of people who only wanted a piece of his legend, never the man himself. Then came the man who would truly own him, Colonel Tom Parker. From the moment Elvis became a star, he ceased to be a human being and became a corporate asset. Parker wasn't a mentor. He was a predator who didn't see a musician, but a printing press. He trapped Elvis in a series of soul-crushing contracts that took 50% of everything he earned. Imagine being the biggest star in history and giving half of your life to a man who wasn't even a legal citizen and had no musical background. Because Parker was an illegal immigrant with no passport, he refused to let Elvis tour overseas. The man who belonged to the whole world was a prisoner of the United States, never allowed to see the fans in Europe or Asia who worshipped him. He was forced into a decade of low-budget, meaningless movies that he hated, singing forgettable songs while the musical revolution of the 60s, led by bands he inspired, passed him by. He was a creative genius who was forbidden from being artistic, forced to play a character in a script written by people who didn't understand him. The isolation of being Elvis was absolute and terrifying. He lived in Graceland, which was less of a home and more of a gilded fortress. He couldn't go to a movie theater, so he had to rent the entire building at midnight. He couldn't go to a theme park, so he had to buy it out for the night just to ride a roller coaster in the dark. This sounds like a dream to some, but it is the ultimate form of solitary confinement. You can never have a spontaneous moment. You can never meet a stranger. You can never just be. To cope with this, he created the Memphis Mafia, a group of friends and relatives who lived on his payroll. This was his only social circle, but it was built on a foundation of money. When you are the one paying for everyone's houses, cars, and medical bills, no one ever tells you no. No one tells you when you're making a mistake. No one tells you when the drugs are turning your brain into mush. Elvis lived in a hall of mirrors where every reflection was a yes man, terrified of losing their paycheck. He was surrounded by people, yet he was the loneliest man on earth. By the time he reached his 30s, the king of rock and roll was already a ghost. To keep up with the grueling schedule his manager demanded, Elvis became a walking pharmacy. He took uppers to wake up, downers to sleep, and painkillers to numb the existential dread of his life. He wasn't taking these drugs to get high. He was taking them to function. He was a man out of balance, living in a permanent chemical haze while performing nearly 700 consecutive sold-out shows in Las Vegas. The monotony was soul-destroying. Night after night, he sang the same songs to people who didn't care about the music. They just wanted to say they saw the icon. He was a creature of the night, rarely seeing the sun, eating massive amounts of junk food just to feel a momentary sense of comfort in a life that felt completely out of his control. He was trapped in a body that was failing him, suffering from glaucoma, an enlarged heart, and chronic bowel issues. Yet he had to wear heavy, suffocating jumpsuits lined with jewels to distract the audience from the fact that he was literally falling apart in front of them. The internal psychological toll was even worse. Elvis was deeply spiritual and obsessed with the meaning of life, but he was surrounded by people who only wanted to hear him sing Hound Dog for the 10,000th time. He would sit up until dawn reading books about philosophy, the occult, and religion, desperately searching for a reason for his suffering. He once asked his hairdresser, "Why was I chosen to be Elvis Presley?" He felt like a freak, a museum exhibit that people paid to stare at. He famously met President Nixon to ask to be made a federal agent, a desperate and bizarre cry for a real identity outside of the music industry. He wanted to matter. He wanted to be something more than a face on a souvenir plate, but the world wouldn't let him. They wanted the king, the myth, the product, not the fragile, hurting man from Mississippi. The end was a nightmare that no one should have to endure. In his final years, Elvis was so medicated and exhausted that he would often forget where he was while on stage. He would mumble through his lyrics, his eyes glazed over, while his manager continued to book more and more shows to pay off his own massive gambling debts. Elvis was being worked to death to fund someone else's addiction. He was a laughingstock to the new generation of punk and rock stars who saw him as a bloated relic of the past, unaware that he was a man who had been slowly consumed by the very industry he created. He was in so much pain that he could barely walk, yet he was pushed onto planes and into limos to fulfill the next contract. On the day he died, he was 42 years old, but his body was that of an 80-year-old man. He died on a bathroom floor, a humiliated figure who had lost his dignity long before he lost his life. Even in death, the tragedy didn't stop. Within hours of his passing, Colonel Tom Parker was already making phone calls to arrange for commemorative merchandise. He didn't cry for a lost friend, he calculated the increase in record sales. Elvis was worth more dead than alive, and the industry knew it. His funeral was a circus, and his body was almost stolen by people looking to make a profit. Being born, Elvis meant that you never truly belonged to yourself. You belonged to the fans who demanded your soul. You belonged to the manager who stole your money, and you belonged to the shareholders who needed the brand to live on. You were a gold mine that was picked clean until there was nothing left but dust. The reason being born Elvis Presley sucked is because it is the ultimate cautionary tale of the American dream. He had the voice, the look, the money, and the fame, yet he was one of the loneliest people to ever live. He was a pioneer who was eventually trampled by the path he cleared. He gave the world a new way to live, a new way to dress, and a new way to express themselves, but he was never allowed to experience that freedom for himself. He lived in a world where he was worshipped as a god, but treated like a slave. He was the king of a kingdom that was actually a high-security prison. Every record he sold was another brick in the wall between him and reality. Next time you see his face on a billboard or hear his voice on the radio, remember the boy from Tupelo who just wanted to make his mother proud, but ended up becoming a sacrifice to the gods of celebrity. He wasn't just a singer. He was a man who was loved by everyone, yet known by no one. He was the most famous man in the world, and that fame was the very thing that ensured he would die alone. That is the true cost of the crown. He proved that you can have everything the world tells you to want and still have absolutely none that matters. He was the king of rock and roll, but he was the ultimate victim of the legend he could never escape.